Hi guys, welcome back to another week of Art Life. I'm just walking Finn in our usual beautiful sunny day walk in Suffolk, and I thought that maybe this week's episode we should do a medium episode. So I've decided it should all be about mixing oil mediums, different kind of mediums you can use for oil paint. So yeah, stay tuned. I'm just going to finish this walk and then I will head back into the studio and get started. I'm Jessie. I've been a full-time artist for 10 years and thought it about time I start sharing my painting techniques and adventures. Subscribe to join me every week for a window into my art life. Back in the studio, and I have laid out all of my oil mediums here for your viewing. There were more than I thought I'd have, actually. The thing about painting practice is over the years you tend to be quite eclectic and have huge amounts of stuff, and if you are like me, you don't throw anything away, so you're left with, I think I've got a medium here which is about 10 years old, so I will show you what's happened to that in a little bit. So this episode is going to be a little bit of history about oil mediums, also a little bit of a demo for those of you who want a bit of a kind of refresher on mixing and blending with different types of oil mediums, but also me just experimenting with this kind of huge subject of what you can do when you add oil mediums to your oil paint. As you know, I'm an oil painter and I often have just gone with the basics and used linseed oil or one of the basic kind of walnut or poppy oils, but these are just a fraction of just how many different mediums you can add to your oils to mix. I did a lot of research, so I've kind of tried to condense it down so it feels quite fluid, but if I do waffle on, you'll have to tell me, because it is quite interesting when you get into the science of it. It becomes almost alchemical with how you can change the viscosity of your oil mediums. The main three things to remember is it is all about the viscosity, the surface finish, and the drying time. These are the three reasons why you would ever need to add a medium to your oil paint. When we went to visit Michael Harding's oil factory last year, Michael said
you don't have to be using a medium. There's no rule. There's not sort of like some activator that you have to be putting in. It can be, you only use a medium if you can't achieve what's in your mind's eye.
He doesn't really add mediums to his oil paint because the paint doesn't need it. He just uses it straight from the tube because that's the effect he likes. That's something to remember about oil mediums if you're thinking about shaking it up and using them with your oil paints. It is all about taste. What effect do you want with your painting? If you're looking for a matte finish or a glossy finish, do you want a thick impasto, like a texture, or do you want it very smooth, like enamel or glass? Oil mediums can give you all of this. The main thing to remember about oil mediums is it's there to just help you change the chemistry of your oils for the effect you need. Often in drying siccative mediums, if you're rushing for an exhibition that needs to be finished, everything needs to be dry in a few days, you'll add a lot of thinners, solvents and siccatives, often synthetic based, to hurry up the drying time of your work. Some impastos, beeswax medium for example, extends the drying time. It makes it very thick and luscious when you mix it with your paint, but then it'll take twice as long for the oil to dry. So do consider that when you are painting which mediums you want and how much time you have to wait for something to dry. So when I was first starting out with oil paint, I was mainly adding mediums to experiment with transparent or opaque effects with the medium. Basically, you need to understand the components of what you're using, and I find a scale is really helpful for that. So at one end of the scale, you have a liquid, fluid kind of consistency, and at the top of the scale, you've got a thick, stiff, almost globulous way of mixing the paint and adding mediums to the oil to give it that kind of stiff effect. I like to be somewhere in the middle where the oil paint becomes buttery. So I like the fluidity of being able to move it across the canvas easily. Obviously, the thicker and stiffer you make your oil medium, the harder it is to kind of scrape off the canvas. If you're more interested in texture and gritty kind of way of painting, Monet was famous for this. He used to really build up the layers of texture in impasto with his mediums. It wasn't all paint with his water lilies. There was some just impasto there to build up the layers because it was so thick. And then you know these kind of textural effects as well as his paintings and compositions and colours themselves. The actual mediums he's using with his paint are as important as the final effect. So we don't think about mixing mediums as this vital part to painting, but it absolutely is. So looking at the journey that mediums have had in history, it's clear to see that as mediums were developed, the effect they gave often was as recognisable to an artist's work as the painting style themselves. If an artist had a very highly polished, highly glossed, dammar, varnish, glazed painting, that could be almost like a style brand for that artist. If their effect is quite rough, not too shiny, quite matte, that again would absorb into the style of the artist. So never underestimate how finishing a painting or adding mediums and glazes will greatly contribute to the artist's style. So let's just look at the history a little bit first, just to see the journey. When researching into the mediums, the most interesting stuff starts to happen around the 15th century. So this is when Belgian painter Jan van Eyck was famously known for adding mediums to his oils to cut the drying time in half, because before then, oil mediums, they weren't drying. They would dry, but they'd still stay quite soft and quite susceptible to damage. And in the way that early Renaissance artists are masters in their craft, they also were experimenters and chemists and alchemists and mathematicians. So these early artists really were obsessed with refining their craft and improving their craft for generations to come, which maybe we don't have as much in our focus nowadays as artists. In the Renaissance, artists were very obsessed with naturalism, with capturing light and shadow. Da Vinci famously improved some of his mediums to capture his early glazes when depicting water and the way that water moves over skin. Messina was also famous for this as well. You see the sfumata effect, the softness with the glazes capturing a more realistic study of life. So the Renaissance was obsessed with the rebirth of studying beauty and light and all the things I love in my practice, and glazes really helped get the effects that these artists were desperate to look for. Comparing Renaissance naturalism to maybe the Byzantine early Renaissance style, you can see it's almost a lot more illustrative. It's still beautiful, but in a very different way, and it is the knowledge of mediums which made, I think, this huge leap in a kind of physical chemistry way. Without these mediums, I don't think the artists that we love from the Renaissance would have been able to get the effects that we still associate with the Renaissance. It might still be slightly in the Dark Ages. So looking at the history, from Reynolds to Rembrandt, artists were mixing their oils with gumtoin, which is meglypis, megilp, basically a mastic varnish and an oil, which could have been walnut, linseed or safflower, maybe even poppy, then cooked with litharge or white lead. So artists were having to do this all themselves in their studios as a craft. They couldn't, like us, just go to the local shop and grab what they needed. They had to make it, which I think makes the process feel so much more well-rounded. And you know, it's not just the final oil painting you've got to think of when you're looking at these paintings. It's all the effort that went in to get the mediums onto that canvas in a time where they were really hard to come by. And using these mediums really changed the way artists were painting. So before they were developing these really interesting mediums, basically oil paints had to completely dry before new layers were added. Otherwise oil would slip off. So in adding resin to these oils, the resin would bind the oil as it dried, keeping it kind of to the surface, which is something I didn't think of. Oil is essentially a kind of glue, an earthy glue. It binds and changes and creates new colours as you're mixing it, and then it sticks to the canvas. You know, can you imagine a time when you were painting and if it wasn't completely dry, it would all slip off? It would be impossible. One of my favourite artists, as you know, is Turner. But I don't think I've ever thought about how his use of the medium meglip basically made his career, made him famous. Yes, he was an incredible painter and a master of light, but he would never have been able to achieve the luminosity he captured with his buttery yellows without the use of his meglip. So megilp, I keep saying meglip, I'm sorry, it's megilp, M-E-G-I-L-P, megilp. It's basically consisting of a resin, which is a mastic from a tree, with lead acetate, some linseed oil and terps. So this would darken over time, but not so much that it would brown. It would stay warm and light, and also give him that kind of it would give him this radiant effect with the glazes as he was adding layers of light to his skies. So I now have a new appreciation for Megilp that I didn't have before, thanks to the fact that I wouldn't love my Turner paintings as much as I do without this amazing medium. Which brings us on to also this idea that when knowledge was shared between a master and apprentice, secret recipes for mediums would have been passed down. Artists were quite secretive about these mixing and blending components, the ratios of different mediums that they were using to create these mixing binding agents, because it was their brand, because it was their recipe for how to make the perfect oil painting. And they knew that if they shared it and it became common knowledge, that they would essentially lose a secret thing that made their paintings so great. So nowadays we should be really grateful for the fact that we can all get the same mediums easily accessible from the companies we love. But back then it would have been like a recipe, like your grandma's recipe for a cake. It would have been almost like cooking. You'd have to cook up these amazing little mediums and keep that secret close to your heart until you became the master and would share that with your apprentice. I kind of miss that sharing of knowledge. But nowadays we don't really need to keep it a secret, because we have also books like this. Now, Painters Handbook is probably not my secret weapon, but definitely something which has given me a lot of knowledge and a lot of help when I'm having a crisis in the studio about how to mix. So it is by Mark David Gottsegen. Gottsegen, I got it right. It's basically supports sizes and grounds, bindings, solvents and thinners, synthetic binders, mural painting techniques, presentation methods. It is literally the most dense book I own for knowledge when it comes to everything you need to do for making, mixing, creating your oil paintings. It is all in here, and I cannot recommend this book enough. What's interesting as well is that it lists everything like a recipe, from stretching your canvases to tools you need, what you'd need if you were going to be making colours and tints, the temperatures you'd need for different chalks and glues if you're mixing different kind of mediums yourself in the studio. It gives you this empowered knowledge, which I think is what we need to take back, looking at all these Renaissance artists who knew all of this stuff. We don't know it. So I highly recommend getting the Painter's Handbook and, like me, trying to learn a little bit about mixing mediums and being a bit more of a chemist in your own art studio. So looking back again at why artists would add lead to their oil mediums when they were cooking up their mixing agents, scientists now know that in mixing lead it would create a highly effective form of O2, oxygen, which would speed up the drying time, but it would also catalyse a formation of elastic organic gel that holds pigments in place when new layers or components are added. Essentially, that means that no longer could paint slip off. It would dry fast enough and bind to the canvas so artists could keep working into their painting. Again, it's the chemistry. Modern megilps like alkyds, they no longer crack. Gamblin's have got a good one. It's a neo meglip, which is it's reformed and non-toxic, because they would have been quite toxic because of the lead. It is quite buttery and it dries quickly. It's basically a 2 to 3 day drying time. If you were interested in maybe doing a Turner transcription, this megilp will be helpful. The big leaps we see in history looking at oil mixing mediums is this kind of discovery of solvents, how turpentine essentially changed everything. The distillation from certain tree saps, it kind of creates a controlled consistency and fluidity. It's a rapid drying time, it's great for cleaning your brushes. Early oil painters will know that adding terps to your brushes will help clean them that much faster. It was also good at cutting through a surface. Often if an artist made a massive mistake in putting solvent on the painting, it would erase it without destroying the canvas underneath. It also gives you a nice dribble effect when you're doing more abstract work, looking at reactions out of your control when you're painting. In using solvents, glazing was also revitalised, creating a new and shinier, more enamel-like effect to finished paintings. Odourless spirits are now preferred. I'll talk a little bit more about that later when I'm showing you my mediums. So with all this progress around solvents as well, there were some losses. And again, it is that knowledge which has been lost. Essentially, I think we are in a bit of a dark age for knowledge when it comes to our mediums that we're using. I know I am. I know that I just use what I have always used, and rarely now do I explore with different mediums to try and get a different effect. We are creatures of habit in our studios. This is why something like this is quite helpful. It's also interesting to see how in baking flaxseed we arrived at a sun-thickened linseed oil, possibly from a oil which was left in the sun by accident and then created quite an enamel glossy medium. Stumbling on things that happen by accident is possibly what happened a lot in history. I am very grateful we no longer have to use black oils, which was when you would mix kind of dammar crystals, which is tree resin, with basically water in an oil emulsion paste, and then add lead white or cook it with lead white to create this black oil. Because while it would give an interesting effect at the time, history now tells us that a lot of old paintings we see which are cracked or dulled with age or need conservation painters and artists to revitalize paintings, it's usually because of the mediums that have now not aged well. So hopefully all the mediums we use in art studios today will age well because of modern technology with more synthetic mediums we can use to counteract that aging effect. However, I thought would be quite an experiment, maybe not in this episode, cracking varnish and aging varnish. I found it in a local art shop. I thought we could do an episode where we try to make a painting look older than it is. You need to add aging varnish first and then cracking varnish, and it should give you an effect like it's hundreds of years old, which could be quite fun. We could almost make a painting look ancient, and even it could be like a week old. I'm sure people use this for like set design, or maybe fraudulent painters trying to pretend they're making a veneer or a Rembrandt. But this could be quite fun. I think it's the equivalent to when you get tea stained paper to make it look like parchment. So maybe that could be a little experiment that we do. As I mentioned before, mediums are all about knowing if you want grounds or varnishes or glazes, or if you want your painting to be looser without brush strokes. Varnishes can often absorb brush marks as they dry, bleeding out almost, so you can get quite a polished finish. You can also add, I found when I'm sculpting with marble, always, or if you ever have marble like dust around, keep it, because if you add it to paint, it gives a really lovely thick, almost like sawdust, or sand in a painting. It dries much quicker, but also gives you a lovely dryness and kind of textural gloopiness to your painting, which is really lovely for kind of effects when you're doing foliage and landscape painting, or just trying something a little bit experimental. So often stuff like marble dust is, you can buy it in art shops or online. Gosh, if you go to Carrara, you can get it off the street. It's amazing. Varnishing paintings is going to be another episode we do with Art Life, but I will just touch on dammar varnish as we start going into the mediums themselves. Usually, I mean, dammar varnish I know became quite popular in the kind of early 19th century. It can be very useful when you add an ounce of dammar with 5 ounces of turps and 1 of stand oil. So usually you're kind of creating a gloss finish, which when a painting is done, it can be quite dull or matte. You add the varnish and it has a beautiful luxurious shine. And when I'm ready to dammar varnish a painting, I will film it and share it with you so you can see the effect of varnish at the end. I mean, I do have a matte varnish. Michael Harding have got this amazing handmade matte varnish, which again gives you a beautiful finish, but it's not shiny like glass. It just is very subtle, and is also great for protecting your oil painting. So if you haven't varnished paintings before and you're thinking about it, I would highly recommend starting with a matte varnish and then maybe progressing to dammar, just to see, maybe do some small experimental paintings and varnish them just to see the effect you can get, because I always think that they make paintings look that much more professional and more, I don't know, expensive. Does that count as a thing? Maybe not expensive, maybe more professional is the right word. Yeah, I think varnished paintings look more professional. So let's start talking about the mediums themselves, their properties, their drying times, the effects they give. And if I do have some here, I'm going to give you a little demo later. Now, 5 centuries of art has told us that linseed oil is basically the easiest pigment to use when you're mixing your oil painting. It has a standard drying time, it's a popular binder, it's basically your tried and tested. It's always good to have a bucket of this somewhere in your studio. So this is actually refined linseed oil. I've got one here from Atlantis Art and one from Winsor & Newton. So the refined linseed oil has actually been steam pressed with sulfuric acid, which gives it a purity, so there'll be no impurities with your linseed oil. I would usually have old honey jars which I'd fill with a little bit of the linseed oil. It is quite yellow. For that reason, sometimes I do use other mediums if I'm not painting a very yellow painting. But for most of what I do, particularly with the big work, when you have a lot of surface area to cover, it's not as expensive as other oils. So I would say linseed oil is the best one to use in the beginning stages when you're starting to add the mediums. And then you can always kind of progress to a more stand oil as you do like the final layers, something more kind of glossy. But this is great. Never underestimate the power of just the standard good stuff, really. The really expensive linseed oil, the really good stuff, is cold pressed. I don't know if you can see, that's actually a slightly paler yellow. So it is stronger with its film, which means it's good for when you're mixing your pigments with your muller. The cold pressed is the best linseed oil to use if you're mixing your pigment with linseed oil. It's also smoother and glossier, which is probably why it's slightly more expensive. So I only have a little bit of this, but it does dry quicker. So again, if you haven't tried cold pressed linseed oil, I would recommend that very much. Now, we were talking about when linseed oil is left in the sun, you can make your own sun thickened linseed oil. Michael Harding does have a recipe for this. Okay, so these are my Linseed Stand Oils. The oldest being 10 years old, which is now completely solid and looks almost like glass. This one is from Old Holland. It's slightly more, actually no, I think they're pretty much the same. And then this is my Michael Harding one. Great if you're making a varnish glaze and you add some stand oil to the dammar varnish and the turps when you're making your glazing medium. It is thicker, so you don't really want to do this in the early stages of painting, obviously because of the fat and lean thing. This is quite a fatty medium, but it makes something look so smooth, and it is perfect for the fine details of painting because it bleeds almost into the brush strokes. With a small paintbrush with fine details, it can make everything look almost photographic if you're looking for a very highly polished finished style. I just think it's a really useful one to have in the studio, not even if you don't want to glaze, but just because having this very kind of luxurious, heavy, thick medium, again, is brilliant for being slightly more experimental if you're trying new techniques. Another one I use a lot is poppy oil. So poppy oil, I've got one here from Michael Harding and one here from C. Robertson. It's like straw, much lighter than linseed oil, and I would recommend using poppy oil if you don't want it too yellow. If you're doing something which doesn't need a lot of yellow, then poppy oil is a really useful medium, and it acts very much like linseed oil with a similar drying time. Safflower and poppy oil are actually quite well known for making whites, when you don't want a white to be too yellow at a paint manufacturer. You'll often see, rather than linseed oil, it's safflower or poppy oil. Okay, but something which dries better than poppy oil, it is less durable than linseed, but I think walnut oil is my current flavour of the month. Actually I need to get some more, there's only a little bit left in there. Again, it is slightly better drying time than poppy oil, not as good as linseed, but it is not as yellow, and it is very beautiful when you're painting with it. I just find, again, it gives me that lovely buttery effect I was telling you about, which I love. Other pigments which I don't have in the studio, so the safflower, I actually don't have any of that here. Inferior oils I would recommend not using include hemp seed, sunflower, soya bean. They're just all much, they're all not very good. Olive oil doesn't even dry. Don't try going into your kitchen and using olive oil. I made that mistake once on holiday in Italy, just to see what happened, and it just didn't dry. But also, I don't have many synthetic mediums in this studio. Like I was talking about the alkyds, they were kind of very popular resin effects, particularly in the 1920s. They used to be coatings for electrical wires, and then in the 1960s, Winsor & Newton made Liquin, which is a very fast drying binder. It can't hold as much paint, It is complex when you're kind of dealing with glazes and applications. It has a matte finish Liquin, and it is quite helpful with the translucency. So again, really good for a synthetic fast drying pigment. Remember we were talking about the secatives earlier. I just don't have any Liquin here, or I could show you. But again, if you are interested in a more fast drying medium, try Liquin from Winsor and Newton. I actually think it's more helpful if I just come down here and show you. This is my station for mediums. Usually there's not many, usually there's not this many out, but I thought it would be helpful just to show you for this episode. Also, it's quite helpful to have these little pots with you at the end of your palette. We've talked about them before. Usually I'll fit one with maybe a walnut oil and one with a linseed, or if I'm kind of doing early layers of work where I want to add terps or odorless solvent to thin out paint for the early layers, because they're leaner, I'll fill one with this turpentine and then another with the oil. So it's always good to have these little pots with you because you can keep dipping your brush in. Again, I was telling you that I do like my honey jars full of the linseed oils. You can actually clean your brushes with like oil as well. You don't always have to use paint diluters or brush cleaners. Zest It is a solvent I highly recommend using. It's non-flammable, which I like, and it also smells really nice. I hate the smell of turpentine. I've actually stopped using terps. I don't even think I've got any here. I do have an odorless solvent. If I have to clean some heavy duty brushes, I would put that in a bucket and clean all my brushes. But the thing that I like about it being non-flammable as well is that with the turpentine, you have to dispose of all your rags and anything with the turpentine, because it is so flammable, almost as hazardous waste. So I tend to just lean towards cleaning my brushes with oils or Da Vinci soap, which is really, really useful. Is this the Da Vinci soap? No, this is the Master soap. Da Vinci soap is kind of green like that, and what you do is when you finish painting, you just run this under a tap and like rub it with soap essentially, and it removes the oil paint from your brushes and keeps them quite healthy, which I like. It keeps them quite soft and supple, because brushes are, you know, the bane of my existence, keeping them tidy. But so that's just some fun little side things I thought, because they're here. Schminke Medium W. I got this from Gordon Harris in Auckland. It was $25 for this tiny little thing. It's for water mixability. So you can add Medium W to oil paint and it makes it water soluble. So when I was backpacking through the mountains and I didn't want to take terps and oil paint and all mediums, all I would do was take Medium W and a bottle of Evian, and I would be able to basically make my oil mediums water soluble and use them almost like watercolors, and then it would evaporate, leaving the oil paint to dry. And then I wouldn't have to worry about all of the other stuff that an oil artist needs when they're traveling. I could just have this, 2 paintbrushes, a few paints and a canvas, and I would be away. So if you are thinking of going on a trip as an oil painter, but you don't want to carry all of the kind of these mediums, Medium W from Schminke, I highly recommend trying it for the adventure painting. What else have I got here? Oh, I've also got, sorry, just going a bit digression, actual pigments as well. These are ochre pigments. We've got different siennas, reds, lapises, and you mix these to maybe one of the stand oils, and you can blend it with my glass muller, and we can make our own paints, which is also really nice, but you couldn't really do without the oil mediums. Have I gone through everything? Last thing here, which again I think I've had this 5 years and I haven't used it. It must have been a gift. It's a blending and glazing medium by Winsor & Newton. Blending and glazing are the same thing. You can do layers and layers of light glazes, particularly if you're painting something full of light. Glazing mediums like that built up over time can be really lovely when you then have the sunlight or a light shining through the paint and you can see all the transparent layers of colour, which is a really fun effect, which is something that mediums give you if you are looking for that effect. That's everything I have. So now I'm just going to do a little demo, just kind of showing you maybe some fun glazes and sort of fun things I do in the studio. Yeah, let's do a demo. Okay, so I've got just a basic primed surface here, which will give us a really good backdrop as we experiment with the different mediums. Just to show you a kind of sample demo, I'm going to be using the find Linseed Stand Oil as one of my thicker spectrum of the oil mediums. A kind of solvent thinner, which will be really helpful just to see when you want to do early thin glazes of oil medium mixing. And then the refined poppy seed oil, which is my favourite medium for using just for myself in my practice. So we'll do, I think, cobalt teal, which will like shine nice and brightly on the orange. And then with the same colour, we'll do all of the mediums and see the different effects. So the first thing I'm going to need is a palette knife. Okay, I actually have some cobalt teal raw pigment, which might be a nice way to start with the stand oil. Just a little bit there, just to see. So the stand oil. Ready? Let's see how thick it is. That's like treacle. I should really be doing this on sandblasted glass, but just for a little sample. This is a glass Muller. So with the palette knife, we're just scraping in the paint, making sure you don't miss any pigment. Again, that's a lovely thick consistency. And you can add more stand oil or linseed oil to loosen it. I want it quite thick because I want it to be the kind of fatter pigment mixing example that we use for today's demo. Okay. It's going to be really stiff. It doesn't really want to part from the brush. So I should add some of those just to show you. It's got already some really juicy texture. Stand oil is brilliant for the kind of final glazes. I would never normally use it at the beginning of anything. It'll have a lovely shine on it. Okay. Helpful tool as to just show. This is just a little bit of white. See. Very, very sort of stiff but slippery, and it looks much more solid than a glaze. You can see how building this up over time would create quite an interesting abstract painting. But already it's starting to slip and dribble, and that's obviously because I've applied it very, very thickly, but just so you can see fatness content with that medium. Not bad, huh?
Great.
Okay, so that's the stand oil. So to contrast now, we'll try a solvent, which is the other end of the spectrum. So I've got a little bit of oil paint. I think, yeah, I'll just pour it straight on here. So that's just some solvent here. So a tiny, tiny dribble of that paint will cover such a large surface. It bleeds into the solvent and thins it out dramatically. So already you can see the difference between the consistency to the thin solvent and the thicker stand oil. and applying this on the paper, applying this on the canvas. See how that dribbles? It's almost invisible. I'll add a little bit of white just to give you more of a dramatic effect for the demo. Thin washes of oil. So you could do the painting like this and it would dry incredibly quickly. This will dry in a few hours. This will take days to dry. So I would recommend starting your painting using a very thin kind of underdrawing with the solvent and then building it up over time. And finally, refined poppy oil, which is just my habit oil of choice. It's that blend of the kind of looseness of the thin medium and the thickness of the stand oil. Again, if I add a little bit of the cobalt blue, there's still a little bit of white on my paintbrush. So it's very thin, but it has a little bit more solidity than the solvent. It kind of glides over the wood here, as you can see. I think if we just try it here. So it's not dribbling like the solvent, but it's not as thick as the stand oil. It just glides off the paintbrush and it blends really, really beautifully. But it's thin enough to allow me to work into it over time, whereas with a very, very glossy varnish layer like this, I wouldn't be able to work into it that much, whereas I would be able to work into it with the poppy oil. Sorry, it looks terrible, but I hope it's like easy to kind of give you the demo of just the different stages of how oil mediums can change the same colour, but into vastly different shades and ways. That's pretty much it. Don't forget, at the end of these videos, I always link below all of the references, tutorials I found helpful, book references. If I've mentioned something and you've already forgotten it, it can be quite helpful to have some of the links that I will attach. I think the most interesting thing I found about researching all of this medium information was that I probably have got too comfortable as well in my practice only using the mediums I know. So being experimental and trying for different effects might actually help push my painting practice in new directions, which is always a nice motivator for January to learn new skills and techniques. I do post on my Instagram at JessOliverArt in my stories when I'm trying a new technique or experiment with mediums, the effects that they're getting. I will share that with you guys if you do follow me on Instagram or social media. So another encouragement to like and follow and subscribe for the channel Art Life and me as a painter. Yeah, it's all about choosing the right one for you. There's no right or wrong. It's, do you like smooth or textured surface, glossy or matte? Do you like impasto or kind of airbrushing? Do you like opaque or transparent? What do you like with painting? What effects do you like? There is always a medium for you. Also, priming your surface is also really important. Sometimes doing a very fixotropic, glossy, smooth surface will change how you paint rather than just painting on normal cotton canvas or linen. So thinking about mediums opens up a whole new world, and there's so much information out there, and I'll just share with you the bits I found helpful. Just thinking about the alchemy and chemistry of all of these mediums. So that's a lot of information I've thrown at you. I hope you found it interesting, and thank you so much for watching. And also please like and subscribe and comment below if there's any mediums you've been using which you think I might find useful or you'd like me to share some more information about. Just let me know. Also, that counts for solvents, and if you think this glazing episode I'm going to do sounds helpful, again, write in the comments below. We love to hear from you. So I think that is all for now. I'm going to carry on with some of this painting and see how far I can get with it. So yeah, I will see you next week, guys. Don't forget to tune in. Bye.